Chapter 10 continued. Mrs. Newcomb must be mad as a wet hen by now, said Uncle Pete. The next day Tom had a close call. Just as he was lifting the cat's milk dish to spill it for the third time, the cat showed up. The huge animal came bounding toward Tom. At the last moment, Tom upset the milk dish under the cat's nose. That stopped the cat long enough for Tom to get away. This plan of yours is too slow, Will, said Uncle Pete. We're going to have to do something else before the cat gets one of us. What can we do? Said Mr. Little. We need larger weapons, said Uncle Pete. I don't know if that's the answer, Uncle Pete, said Mr. Little. Besides, that takes time too. You're right, though, this plan isn't working. I heard Mrs. Newcomb telling Mr. Newcomb not to get rid of the cat. She's afraid the mice will return. And she likes the cat, Mr. Little went on. Thinks it's cute. She says it's high-spirited. Not only that, said Mrs. Little. We can't break up everything in the house just to get rid of the cat. It's the Biggs' house, after all. Why don't we try taming the cat? Said Tom. What? Said Uncle Pete. Let's see if we can tame it, repeated Tom. Cats have been friends to men since the early days of history. Uncle Pete looked from Mrs. Little to Mr. Little. Do you hear what the boy is saying? He said. He's gone soft in the head. No kidding, Dad, said Tom. It's true. The early Egyptians thought cats were gods. They had them all over the place. They did they? Said Uncle Pete. Where did you hear such nonsense? I read it in one of the Biggs history books, said Tom. Uncle Pete snorted. A cat has never been a friend to a little, I can tell you that. Maybe that's because none of them ever tried to tame a cat, said Tom. They were always afraid of cats. What kind of silly talk is that, boy? Said Uncle Pete. Look at the size of the beast. Who could tame such a monster? Men tame elephants, said Tom. Tom has an interesting idea, said Mr. Little. Perhaps we're worried too much about the size of the cat. Because we're so small, we've always thought all large animals were our enemies. Maybe that's wrong. I don't like the way this talk is going, said Uncle Pete. It's against everything we littles believe. Making friends with a cat is like making friends with a rattlesnake. Tom is saying it's not the same thing, said Mr. Little. Cats are friendly to men. Rattlesnakes are not. None of the little
Mr. Joel, can you contact the office, please?
Now we may be little, said Mr. Little, but we are men. Of course we are, said Uncle Pete. He looked sideways at his tail. We're not animals. Then why can't we have a cat around the house just like other people? Of all the silly ideas, said Uncle Pete. Oh dear, said Mrs. Little. It sounds all right, but I don't know. Why, it's a wonderful idea, said Granny Little. It's so simple. Simple-minded, said Uncle Pete. Why didn't someone think of it before? Said Granny Little. Because it's a cuckoo idea, that's why, said Uncle Pete. Now see here, Peter Little, said Granny Little. Mind your manners. She stood up. Her ball of knitting yarn fell from her lap. It rolled between Mr. Little's feet. I've lived a few more days than you have, and I know a few more things than you do, too. Mr. Little picked up the ball of yarn. He tossed it gently in the air a few times. We could start taming the cat by giving her a present. Show her we mean to be friendly. Give her something to play with, said Tom. How about that ball of yarn your father is fiddling with, said Granny Little. Don't cats like to play with things like that? As a matter of fact, Granny, they do, said Mr. Little. Will that make her friendly? Said Mrs. Little. It might help, said Mr. Little. We could roll a ball of yarn at the cat and see what happens. All we have to do is make sure we have room to get out of the way if she doesn't get the idea. I'm against it, said Uncle Pete. Too dangerous. Cats are cats. You can't change them. There's a large ball of yarn in Mrs. Biggs' sewing basket, said Lucy. I lifted it once. It's lighter than anything. Let's get it, said Mr. Little. I think it's worth trying. He looked at Uncle Pete. That is, if no one else has any better ideas. Count me out, said Uncle Pete. I'll stay here and sharpen my sword.